The invitation arrived on a cold, windless afternoon, slipped beneath my door like a snake gliding into a lair. The parchment was old, edges frayed, the ink slightly smudged as though it had been written in haste, or perhaps by an unsteady hand. "You are cordially invited to the New Year's Eve dinner at Hawthorne Manor," it read. "Celebrate the turning of the year with our family tradition. Midnight toast to honor the past." It was unsigned, yet I knew it could only have come from my cousin Edward. The name Hawthorne Manor alone made me hesitate, a shadow of unease settling over me. I hadn't stepped foot in that house in over a decade, not since my parents whispered warnings about the tragedies that seemed to befall its occupants. The place was notorious in the village, for reasons no one dared speak aloud. And yet, I found myself clutching the invitation tightly. The guilt of refusing Edward's earlier attempts to reconnect weighed on me. "Family ties are fragile," my late mother had often said, her tone sharp with warning. When I arrived at the manor that evening, the world was blanketed in heavy snow, each step up the long, winding driveway muffled as though the earth itself held its breath. Hawthorne Manor loomed ahead, a monstrous silhouette against the pale moonlight. Its spires pierced the sky, their jagged edges crowned by icicles that dripped slowly, each drop hanging for an eternity before falling. Edward greeted me at the door, his face gaunt, but his smile warm, too warm. His handshake was firm, yet his fingers were unnaturally cold, even through his gloves. "Welcome back," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't place. Nostalgia, regret. The inside of the manor was suffocatingly warm, the roaring fire in the great stone hearth doing little to dispel the strange chill that clung to me. The long dining table stretched across the main hall, set with pristine silverware and glittering crystal goblets. Guests milled about, their faces vaguely familiar but distant, as if seen through foggy glass. Edward led me to the dining room, his hand hovering lightly over my shoulder. "It's tradition, you see," he murmured as we passed a grand portrait of a stern-looking man with hollow eyes. "A toast to ring in the new year, an homage to our roots." I wanted to ask what exactly he meant, but found my voice caught in my throat. The air in the room seemed heavier, and I swore I heard faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing. The guests were seated when the first strange occurrence took place. As I took my seat near the head of the table, I noticed a peculiar centerpiece, a large, tarnished goblet encrusted with ruby-like stones that gleamed faintly in the firelight. Its surface was etched with intricate patterns, almost glyph-like, that seemed to shimmer and shift when viewed out of the corner of my eye. Edward stood, raising a hand to silence the murmurs of conversation. "Family and friends," he began, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Tonight, we honor an ancient tradition passed down through generations, a toast, not just to welcome the new year, but to acknowledge the past and its hold on us." The room grew quieter still, the tension palpable. I felt the prickling sensation of being watched, though no eyes were on me. "Now," Edward said, lifting the goblet reverently, "we pass the vessel." The goblet made its way down the table, its weight borne with care by each guest. When it reached me, I hesitated. Up close, the vessel felt alive, thrumming faintly in my hands as though some unseen force pulsed within. A faint whisper brushed against my ears, not from Edward or the other guests, but from the goblet itself. I could not make out the words, but the tone was low and insistent, like a snake's hiss. "Go on," Edward said softly, his gaze fixed on me with unnerving intensity. "Recite the words etched around the rim. It's tradition." My eyes flicked to the faintly glowing inscriptions, barely legible in the flickering candlelight. The symbols were unfamiliar, a mix of archaic runes and flowing script. Yet as my lips began to move, the words poured from me as if I had known them all my life. By blood and bond, by time unbroken, the past calls to the present. Drink and remember. The moment I finished, the room shuddered imperceptibly, as though the house itself had exhaled. The air turned cold, the firelight dimmed, and a faint ringing echoed in my ears. I passed the goblet to the next guest with trembling hands, but they seemed not to notice my unease. One by one, each guest repeated the incantation, their voices blending into a rhythmic chant that reverberated through the room. As the goblet returned to Edward, he stood once more, raising it high. "And now," he intoned, his voice filled with something between reverence and dread, "we drink to the past." He brought the goblet to his lips and drank deeply. The guests followed suit, each sip accompanied by a faint, collective sigh. When it was my turn, the liquid burned as it slid down my throat, sharp, metallic, yet oddly sweet. The grandfather clock in the corner began to chime, its deep, resonant tones counting down to midnight. But as the 12th chime echoed, a 13th followed, an unnatural, jarring note that sent a wave of nausea through me. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that seemed to push against my chest. Shadows flickered on the walls, stretching and twisting as though alive. And then I saw them. Faces in the darkness, watching from the edges of the room, twisted, angry, hollow-eyed. The goblet, now resting on the table, began to shake violently, the ruby stones glowing with an eerie red light. "Welcome them," Edward whispered, his face pale and eyes wide. The shadows surged forward. The room seemed to tilt, a slow, sickening shift that made the floor feel unsteady beneath me. The shadows, thick and liquid-like, rippled toward us, coalescing into shapes that defied explanation. They weren't merely silhouettes. They had form, weight, and an unsettling presence that filled the air with something sharp and metallic, like the taste of old coins. Edward remained standing at the head of the table, his face an unreadable mask of dread and fascination. "Do not look away," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "They demand acknowledgement." Despite his command, every fiber of my being screamed for me to run. The faces in the darkness had taken on more definition now. Sunken eyes, pale and withered skin stretched over angular bones. Their expressions were raw with anguish, their mouths moving as if silently screaming. "Who are they?" I managed to whisper, though the words felt like they scraped their way out of my throat. Edward's eyes met mine, a hollow sadness in them. "The forgotten, the wronged, the ones bound to us by blood and betrayal." The others at the table sat frozen, their eyes wide, some darting to the edges of the room where the shadows loomed closer. A low murmur began to rise, not from the guests, but from the shadows themselves, a fractured chorus of voices, distorted and layered, echoing off the walls. "Remember," one voice hissed, clear and sharp. "Pay," said another, guttural and low. The chandelier above us flickered violently, casting distorted light that made the specter's features ripple unnervingly. One of them, taller than the others, with empty hollow sockets where its eyes should have been, stepped closer to Edward. Its movement was jerky, as though it were being dragged forward by an invisible force. "You promised," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. Edward didn't flinch, though his hands gripped the edge of the table tightly, his knuckles pale. "I know," he replied, his voice breaking. "But they must understand. This is their debt too." The specter's hollow gaze shifted toward me, and I felt the weight of its stare like icy claws digging into my chest. "You took the toast," it whispered, its words slicing through the air like a blade. "No," I stammered, my voice cracking. "I didn't know." "You spoke the words," it interrupted, stepping closer. Its presence brought with it a suffocating cold, and the smell of damp earth and decay filled my nose. Edward raised a hand as if to shield me, but the specter reached through it, its translucent arm passing effortlessly through him. Its jagged fingers stopped just inches from my face, and for a moment, I thought I felt them brushing against my skin, impossibly cold. "The curse is not ours alone," it hissed, its voice reverberating through my skull. "It is yours now, yours to bear, yours to end." The whispers grew louder, the cacophony filling my ears until I could barely hear my own panicked breathing. My vision blurred, the room spinning, and the specter's face twisted into a grotesque mockery of human expression, a grin too wide, teeth too sharp. "Stop!" I screamed, pushing myself back from the table, the chair clattering to the floor behind me. As suddenly as they had appeared, the shadows recoiled, retreating to the edges of the room like smoke sucked into an unseen void. The air grew still, unbearably heavy, and Edward finally sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. "You've doomed us all," he murmured. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of the clock's pendulum. It was then that I noticed the time. It was past midnight, yet the clock's face seemed wrong. The hands ticked backward, the seconds unwinding. "What is happening?" One of the guests, a man I didn't recognize, asked, his voice trembling. "The ritual is incomplete," Edward replied without looking up. "And now they are here to judge us, to weigh our sins." The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. I looked at the other guests, their faces pale and tight with fear. Each one sat motionless, as if the very act of moving might draw the attention of the lingering specters. "What sins?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What are you talking about?" Edward finally lifted his head, and in his eyes, I saw the weight of a lifetime of secrets. "Our family is cursed," he said simply. "This house, this ritual, it's all we have to keep them at bay, to appease them." The words hung heavy in the air, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. Appease them? How? Edward gestured toward the goblet, now still and silent at the center of the table. Its ruby stones no longer glowed, but a faint shimmer remained on its surface, as if it were waiting. "Every year, the toast binds one of us to them," he said. "We drink to the past, and in return, they let us live another year." The room erupted into chaos. Guests shouted, some pushing back from the table, others demanding answers. I remained frozen, my gaze fixed on the goblet. "But this time," Edward continued, his voice quieter now, "something went wrong. The curse, it wasn't meant for you." The specters began to reappear, their forms more solid now. They moved with purpose, their hollow gazes fixed on each of us in turn. One, the tall figure with the empty eyes, reached for Edward, its hand hovering just above his chest. "You lied," it growled. "You broke the bond." "I had no choice," Edward shouted, his composure crumbling. "The bloodline is fading. The new generation must—" The specter's hand plunged into Edward's chest, and his scream was a sound I would never forget. It wasn't pain. It was something deeper, a soul-wrenching cry of terror and despair. I scrambled to my feet, my instincts screaming at me to run, but the specters turned their attention to the rest of us. One by one they moved closer, their whispering voices growing louder. "Debt," they said in unison. "Blood for blood, life for life." And then they began to choose. The room was a cage of despair, its walls trembling as if the house itself recoiled from the horrors within. The shadows surged forward, their forms more defined now, twisted remnants of humanity with hollow faces and claw-like hands. The air vibrated with their whispers, each word a dagger slicing through my sanity. "Debt must be paid," they chanted, their voices a sickening harmony of despair and fury. Edward's lifeless body slumped forward, his face frozen in a grotesque mask of terror. The tall specter loomed above him, its skeletal fingers still buried deep in his chest. It turned toward me, its eyeless sockets burning with an unseen fire. "You will finish it," it hissed, the words scraping against my mind. Panic clawed at my chest as the other guests screamed, their cries swallowed by the oppressive weight of the specter's presence. One by one, the shadows descended upon them, their clawed hands plunging into chests, wrenching out something unseen but vital. Each victim fell silent, their bodies crumpling to the floor, faces locked in expressions of sheer agony. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow and rapid, my vision tunneling. My mind screamed at me to flee, but the house seemed to trap me, the air itself thick and unyielding. Then I saw it, the goblet. It sat untouched at the center of the table, its ruby stones now glowing faintly, pulsing like a beating heart. The etchings along its surface shimmered, and the words I had spoken earlier echoed in my mind. By blood and bond, by time unbroken. Desperation gripped me. The specters fed on us, on our fear, but the goblet was their tether. If I could sever it, if I could break whatever connection it held, maybe I could end this. I lunged for the goblet, my trembling hands closing around its cold, metallic surface. The moment I touched it, a shock of searing pain shot up my arms, and a deafening scream filled my head. "No!" The tall specter materialized before me, its form swelling, its presence suffocating. It loomed closer, its voice a guttural roar that rattled my skull. "You dare defy the bond?" it snarled. "You are bound to us now. There is no escape." I clutched the goblet tighter. The words of the inscription burned into my memory. "By blood and bond," I began, my voice faltering but defiant. The specter shrieked, and the other shadows recoiled, their movements frantic and distorted. I pressed on, forcing the words from my lips despite the fire burning in my veins. By time unbroken, I severed the chain. The goblet grew unbearably hot, its ruby stones flaring with an intense, blinding light. The air around me vibrated violently, the whispers turning to screams, then silence. The tall specter lunged, its claws reaching for me, but I hurled the goblet to the ground with all my strength. It shattered into countless pieces, the sound a piercing wail that cut through the very fabric of the house. A blinding light erupted from the shards, engulfing the room. The specters wailed, their forms disintegrating into shadows and smoke, swirling upward before vanishing entirely. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time that night, the air felt still. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The room was empty now, save for the shattered goblet and the lifeless bodies of the guests. Edward lay slumped over, his face peaceful in death, as though released from a burden too heavy to bear. The grandfather clock chimed once, twice, then fell silent. I stumbled to my feet, my legs trembling, and staggered toward the door. It opened easily now, the house no longer resisting my escape. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon. As I made my way down the driveway, I glanced back at Hawthorne Manor. The house seemed smaller now, its towering spires no longer looming with the same menace. But in the faint morning light, I saw something that froze me in place. On the porch, nestled among the shattered shards of the goblet, lay one of its ruby stones, faintly pulsing like a dying ember. The whispers were gone, but a single thought filled my mind, chilling me to the core. The chain may be broken, but the curse lingers. I turned and walked away, the weight of the past pressing on my shoulders. The new year had come, but it was far from a clean slate.